The messenger arrived with dust on his boots and fear in his eyes. He had ridden for days, past burned villages, past blackened fields, past the silence where towns used to stand. He only needed to say one name, and the room went quiet, and the children were gathered close, and the prayers began. His name was Attila, and he was coming. Tonight we follow the complete story of the most feared man in the ancient world. From the open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe to the gates of Rome itself. Settle in, let the day fall away, and we will take our time. The Eurasian steppe is one of the great geographical facts of the ancient and medieval world, and understanding it is essential to understanding Attila and the people he led. It is an enormous band of grassland stretching from Hungary in the west to Manchuria in the east. Thousands of miles of rolling terrain broken by rivers and occasional mountain ranges, with very few trees and very few fixed settlements. A landscape that seems empty to people who are accustomed to forests and farms, but that is, in fact, full of life for those who know how to read it. The Huns were one of the peoples who had lived in and around this steppe for generations. They were nomadic pastoralists, which means they moved with their herds across the grassland, following the seasonal rhythms of grazing, living in felt tents called yurts that could be assembled and dismantled quickly, their possessions calibrated to what could be carried on horseback or on the wheeled wagons that the ancient sources describe as their mobile homes. Their entire culture oriented around the horse in a way that settled agricultural peoples found almost incomprehensible. The relationship between the Huns and their horses was not merely practical. It was foundational to everything about how they lived and thought and fought. Children learned to ride almost before they learned to walk. A Hunnic man spent more of his waking life on horseback than on foot. The skills of horsemanship and mounted archery that the steppe peoples developed over generations were so far in advance of anything that settled peoples could produce that the gap was almost a difference in kind rather than degree. A Hunnic archer could ride at full gallop and shoot accurately in any direction, including directly behind him, could reload with the speed that comes from 10,000 hours of practice, could maintain this for hours without tiring in a way that infantry or even ordinary cavalry simply could not match. This military advantage was the foundation of the Hunnic expansion westward that brought them into the world of late Roman history. The Huns began moving west from the central steppe sometime in the 4th century AD, pushing into the territory of the Alans and then into the territory of the Goths, who lived north of the Black Sea. The Gothic kingdoms, which were themselves formidable military powers, were overwhelmed with a speed that astonished contemporary observers, and that set in motion the cascade of population movement that Rome called the barbarian migrations, and that would ultimately contribute to the transformation of the Western Empire. The Goths, who fled the Huns, crossed the Danube into Roman territory in 376 AD, requesting permission to settle within the empire's borders, and the Romans catastrophically mismanaged the situation. The Gothic refugees were treated badly, their leaders were insulted, their people were exploited by corrupt officials, and the result was the Gothic revolt that culminated in the Battle of Adrianople in 378, in which the Goths killed the Emperor Valens and destroyed a Roman army with a totality that shocked the empire, and that permanently altered the relationship between Rome and the peoples north of its borders. The Huns themselves were not yet a direct problem for Rome at this point. They were a problem for Rome's neighbors and for the stability of Rome's frontier regions. But they were already changing the world that Rome depended on, and within a generation they would become something much more immediate. The origins of the Huns are one of the more contested questions in ancient and early medieval history. The ancient sources primarily Roman and Greek. Writers who knew the Huns from the outside, and who were sometimes horrified and sometimes fascinated by them, describe a people so different from Mediterranean norms that their descriptions slide easily into the fantastic. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus, who is one of the best sources for the late Roman period, and who wrote in the late 4th century, describes the Huns as barely human, eating raw meat, having no fixed dwellings, knowing nothing of agriculture, their faces deliberately scarred as infants to prevent beard growth, their bodies so accustomed to the horse that they could barely walk on foot. Some of this is observation, and some of it is the distortion of cultural incomprehension, and some of it is deliberate othering, the construction of a category of the savage that served Roman cultural purposes regardless of its accuracy. The Huns were genuinely very different from Roman society in their material culture and their social organization, but they were not subhuman, and the later and better sources, including the account of Priscus of Penium, who actually visited Attila's court, show a society of considerable complexity and sophistication operating according to its own coherent values. Where the Huns came from before they appeared on the western steppe is a question that has generated enormous scholarly debate. The most widely discussed theory connects them to the Jannu, a confederation of steppe peoples who had been a major power on the eastern steppe and in conflict with the Chinese Empire for centuries. The Jannu were eventually defeated and dispersed, and some of their constituent peoples may have moved westward over the course of a century or more, until they emerged as the Huns on the western steppe. This connection is debated, and the linguistic and archaeological evidence does not definitively prove it. But it remains the most coherent, large-scale explanation for where the Huns came from. What is less debated is the nature of Hunnic society by the time they appear clearly in the historical record. They were organized in a loose confederation of tribal groups under the authority of a paramount leader. The confederation was held together more by the personal authority of the leader and by the economic and military benefits of unity than by any fixed institutional structure. It was a political form that could be enormously powerful when the right person was at its head, and that tended to fragment rapidly when that person was gone, which is exactly what the history of the Hunnic Confederation demonstrates. Attila's family, the Aemolian dynasty, had been paramount among the Huns for at least a generation before him. His uncle Rua, or Rugila, as he is sometimes called in the sources, had been the Hunnic paramount leader and had already established the pattern of extracting tribute from Rome in exchange for peace on the Danube frontier. The Romans paid Rua a substantial annual sum to maintain their alliance and to keep the Huns from crossing into imperial territory. And this payment, which was dressed up in various diplomatic language, but which was in functional terms, tribute paid by a superpower to a threatening neighbor, established the framework that Attila would inherit. Attila was born probably around 406 AD, the son of Munjuk, one of Rua's brothers. And he grew up in the mobile court of the Hunnic Confederation, learning the skills that every Hunnic man learned: riding and archery and the management of horses, but also acquiring something more specific to his position: the political skills of the Confederation's ruling family, the understanding of how to manage the complex relationships among the tribal leaders who owed nominal allegiance to the paramount chief, the knowledge of Roman political culture that came from the exchange of hostages and envoys that was part of the Romano-Hunnic relationship. The exchange of hostages was a standard diplomatic practice in the ancient world, and it shaped both parties in ways that went beyond the political security it provided. Young nobles sent as hostages to foreign courts spent years in those courts, learned the languages and the customs and the political methods of people who were formally their hosts and practically their captors. and came home with knowledge and perspectives that were genuinely useful, even if the experience of the hostage years was personally complicated. Attila was sent at some point in his youth to the Roman court, and a Roman nobleman named Idius, who would later become the great general and effective ruler of the Western Roman Empire, was sent to the Hunnic court in exchange. This parallel experience meant that the two men who would eventually face each other as the greatest commanders of their respective worlds had spent time in each other's cultures during their formative years. Idius, in particular, developed a genuine affinity for Hunnic culture and maintained close ties with the Huns throughout his career. Using Hunnic military forces as mercenaries and relying on personal connections built in those early years, Rua died in 434 AD, probably from a lightning strike, according to some sources, and was succeeded by his two nephews jointly, Attila and his brother Bleda. The joint leadership was a common arrangement in steppe confederacies, and it reflected the reality that maintaining unity among the Hunnic tribal leaders required distributing power rather than concentrating it entirely. But it also created an inherent tension when the two leaders had different visions, or different temperaments, or simply different interests. In the early years of their joint rule, Attila and Bleda extended the pattern that Rua had established. They met with Roman envoys and negotiated the Treaty of Margus in 435 AD, which dramatically increased the annual payment Rome made to the Huns and included terms requiring the Romans to return Hunnic refugees who had fled into Roman territory and not to make alliances with Rome's enemies. These terms were humiliating to Roman dignity, but the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius II accepted them because the alternative, a major Hunnic assault on the Danube frontier, was worse. The treaty demonstrates something important about Attila's approach to power. He was not primarily a destroyer. He was an extortionist in the most precise sense of that word. He used the credible threat of destruction to extract wealth and political concessions from people who were rich enough to pay and frightened enough to do so. The Huns could have crossed the Danube and raided deep into Roman territory, but raids were expensive in men and horses and produced uncertain returns. Regular tribute extracted under diplomatic pressure was more efficient and more profitable, and Attila understood this with a clarity that his Roman counterparts found both admirable and infuriating. The joint rule of Attila and Bleda lasted until around 444 or 445 AD, when Bleda died. The ancient sources are unanimous that Attila killed him, though the circumstances are not clearly described. Fratricide was not uncommon in the violent politics of steppe confederacies, and the elimination of a potential rival and co-leader was a rational act from the perspective of power consolidation, even if it was a terrible one from a human perspective. With Bleda gone, Attila was the sole ruler of the Hunnic Confederation, and the full force of his ambition and ability was now directed without division. The campaigns that followed Bleda's death established Attila's reputation as the Scourge of God, a title that appears in later sources and that captures something of how the Roman world experienced his attacks. He launched a massive campaign into the Eastern Roman Empire in 447 AD that the sources describe with a scale of destruction that is difficult to independently verify, but that clearly represented a catastrophic assault on the Danubian provinces. His forces penetrated deep into Thrace and Macedonia. They approached Constantinople. They defeated several Roman armies in the field, and the Eastern Emperor was reduced to accepting even more humiliating terms and an even larger annual payment. The physical scale of what the Hunnic forces destroyed during these campaigns can be partially assessed through archaeology. Settlement sites along the Danubian frontier show destruction layers from this period. Abandoned settlements, burned buildings, the material evidence of communities that did not recover. The disruption of the agricultural and commercial networks that supported the Eastern Roman economy was probably as damaging as the direct military losses. When farmers abandoned their fields and merchants stopped trading and craftsmen fled their workshops, the long-term economic effects rippled outward, far beyond the areas directly attacked. The question of what Attila's army actually looked like and how it operated is one that the sources address imperfectly. The core of his forces were Hunnic cavalry, the mounted archers who had been the Huns' primary military advantage since they first appeared on the western steppe. But by Attila's time, the Hunnic Confederation included numerous subject peoples who contributed various kinds of military force. Germanic warriors from the Ostrogoths and the Gepids, and other peoples who had been incorporated into the Confederation. Infantry and siege specialists who gave Attila capabilities the earlier Huns had lacked. The siege capacity is particularly significant because the earlier Huns had been primarily raiders, unable to take walled cities and therefore limited in what they could destroy and what they could threaten. By Attila's time, the Hunnic forces had acquired the knowledge and equipment needed to conduct proper sieges, either through the capture of Roman engineers and specialists or through the adoption of practices learned during their long interaction with Roman civilization. This meant that Attila could threaten not just the open countryside, but the walled cities that were the true centers of Roman civilization and wealth. The political life of the Hunnic court in these years is described in remarkable detail by Priscus of Penium, a Greek diplomat who traveled to Attila's court in 449 AD as part of an Eastern Roman embassy and who wrote an account of his journey and his time there. That is one of the most extraordinary documents of the late antique world. Priscus was an educated and observant man who wrote without the reflexive contempt that characterized many Roman descriptions of barbarians, and his account gives us something genuinely rare, a detailed description of the Hunnic court from the inside. The journey to Attila's court took the Roman embassy through the Danubian provinces and north into what is now Hungary, through a landscape that had been part of the Roman Empire but that was now Hunnic territory. They crossed rivers on rafts and traveled through settlements that were clearly transitional between Roman and Hunnic cultural forms. They met Hunnic nobles and their Roman and Gothic wives and mixed-culture households that demonstrated how thoroughly the Hunnic world had absorbed elements of the cultures it had conquered. Attila's capital, if it can be called that, was a large settlement on the Hungarian plain that the sources describe as a kind of village of wooden buildings surrounded by wooden palisades. Not a city in the Roman sense, not built to last, not organized according to the grid plans of Roman urban design, but a functioning center of political and economic life that could accommodate large gatherings, and that reflected the organizational capacity of a major power. The Great Hall, where Attila feasted his followers and received his guests, was a building of considerable size, described by Priscus as made of carved and polished wood, decorated with embroidered hangings, furnished with tables and couches in the Roman manner that Attila had adopted without apparently feeling any inconsistency about the adoption. The feasts that took place there were elaborate social rituals that combined Hunnic and Roman practices in ways that were genuinely distinctive. Priscus describes the feast he attended at Attila's court with the detail of a man who understood that he was witnessing something unusual and wanted to record it faithfully. The guests were seated in a specific order that reflected their rank and their relationship to Attila. The food and wine were served with ceremonial attention to precedence. Toasts were drunk in a sequence that had clear social meaning, and Attila himself sat at the center of it all, observing and participating with a composure that Priscus found striking. What Priscus describes is not a savage eating raw meat in a field, but a ruler presiding over a sophisticated court ritual that served the political function of demonstrating hierarchy and rewarding loyalty, while being conducted in a distinctively Hunnic register. The food was simpler than Roman food, served on wooden plates rather than silver or gold. And Attila himself drank from a wooden cup while his guests were served in metal vessels. A deliberate contrast that Priscus notes as characteristic of a man who was making a point about his indifference to the luxury that others valued. The physical description of Attila that Priscus provides is one of the few surviving attempts at a genuine portrait. He was short, with a broad chest and a large head, small, deep-set eyes, a flat nose, a sparse beard tinged with gray and swarthy skin. He moved with a rolling gait that Priscus attributes to his habit of riding rather than walking. He wore plain clothes without ornamentation, in contrast to the elaborately dressed noblemen around him. And his manner was proud without being showy, confident without being aggressive. The bearing of a man who knew exactly what he was and had no need to perform it. The story that Priscus tells about the embassy's purpose is as interesting as his descriptions of the court. The Eastern Roman embassy was there partly to discuss political matters and partly because there was a plot being run by one of the emperor's ministers to assassinate Attila. The Roman government had decided that it was cheaper and tidier to kill Attila than to keep paying him, and they had enlisted a Hunnic nobleman named Edico to help. But Edico had betrayed the plot to Attila, and the Roman ambassadors arrived at a court that knew about the assassination plan and was waiting to see how the Romans would handle it. Attila chose not to make an immediate diplomatic incident of the revelation. He played with the Roman ambassadors, allowed them to conduct their business, gave them meals and entertainments, and then revealed at the end that he knew about the plot and expelled the chief conspirators from the embassy without causing them further harm. The restraint was deliberate and made a specific point. He was not going to be killed by Roman treachery, and he was not going to give Rome the provocation of responding to the revelation with open hostility. He chose the response that demonstrated the most power, which was calm contempt. Priscus also describes an encounter during the journey to Attila's court that has become one of the most famous passages in his work. He met a man near one of the Danubian river crossings who was dressed as a Scythian, which is to say, as a steppe nomad, but who spoke Greek. And when Priscus addressed him in Greek, they had a conversation in which the man, who turned out to be a former Roman merchant who had been captured by the Huns and had eventually gained his freedom and prospered under Attila's rule, made the argument that life under Attila was in many ways better than life in the Roman Empire. The argument he made was specific and pointed. In the Roman Empire, the poor were taxed to exhaustion. The legal system protected the wealthy and ground down everyone else. The armies that were supposed to defend the provinces failed to do so, and the corruption that ran through every level of the administration made justice a purchasable commodity rather than an accessible right. Under Attila, the man said, you fought when there was fighting and were left alone the rest of the time. The powerful did not prey on the weak through the legal system, and the rewards of good service were real. Priscus, who was a loyal Roman and who had spent his career in the service of the Eastern Empire, found this argument unsettling enough to record it in detail, which tells us something about the honesty of his account and something about the genuine failures of late Roman governance that made such comparisons possible. The Roman Empire of the 5th century was not the well-administered state of the high imperial period. It was a system under severe stress, its tax base eroded by the loss of territory and population, its administrative capacity compromised by the political instability and the quality of the people running it, its military effectiveness undermined by the increasing reliance on federate barbarian forces, whose loyalty was contractual rather than ideological. The Western Empire in particular was by the 440s and 450s in serious difficulty. It had lost Africa to the Vandals under Gazaric in 429 to 439 AD, a loss that removed the richest agricultural province from the tax base and that permanently damaged the empire's economic capacity. It had lost much of Spain. It was losing control of Gaul incrementally to the Visigoths and Burgundians and Franks, who were settling in its territories, nominally subjects of the empire, but effectively independent, and its ability to project military force against major external threats was severely compromised. The one great military asset the Western Empire possessed was Flavius Idius, a man whose career was as extraordinary as any in Roman history. He had spent his hostage years among the Huns and had developed both a genuine understanding of steppe military methods and a network of personal relationships among Hunnic leaders that he exploited throughout his career. He had used Hunnic forces as mercenaries to defeat his rivals in Roman politics in the 420s and 430s. He had maintained the fiction of Roman military effectiveness in Gaul through a combination of genuine tactical skill and the judicious use of the federates, whose territory he could not actually control. Idius and Attila had known each other since their shared hostage years, and for much of their careers, their relationship was one of mutual exploitation rather than straightforward enmity. Attila provided mercenary forces that helped Idius maintain his position. Idius maintained a Roman policy that avoided provoking the Huns into a major Western campaign. Each man understood the other well enough to maintain a functional relationship that served both their interests. This relationship ended in 450 AD with a combination of events that made the Great Western Campaign inevitable. The proximate cause that the ancient sources most commonly cite is one of the more extraordinary stories in Roman history. Anuria, the sister of the Western Roman Emperor Valentinian III, had been found in a compromising situation with one of the palace officials and had been confined to a kind of gilded house. Arrest and faced the prospect of a politically arranged marriage to a dull senator that she found intolerable. In desperation, she sent a ring and a message to Attila, and the message, depending on which source you read, either explicitly proposed marriage or was interpreted by Attila as proposing marriage, and Attila chose to interpret it as a formal proposal of marriage, along with a claim to half the Western Empire as her dowry. This interpretation was certainly convenient for his purposes, if not necessarily what Anuria had in mind, and he made it the formal justification for his invasion of the Western Empire, announcing that he was coming to claim his bride and her inheritance. Whether Attila believed this or was using it as diplomatic cover for an invasion he wanted to conduct for other reasons is a question the sources debate. The tribute payments from the East had been reduced following the death of Theodosius II in 450 AD, and his replacement by the more assertive Marcian, who refused to continue the payments. The Western Empire was militarily weaker than the Eastern Empire and potentially more profitable to raid, and the Hunnic Confederation needed the regular infusion of wealth that successful military pressure produced to maintain the loyalty of the tribal leaders, who were the Confederation's constituent parts. The campaign of 451 AD into Gaul was the largest military operation Attila had ever conducted in the West. His forces crossed the Rhine in the spring and moved rapidly through northeastern Gaul. The accounts describe a force of extraordinary size, though the specific numbers given in the ancient sources which sometimes reach into the hundreds of thousands, are almost certainly exaggerated in the manner of ancient military accounting, which was rarely precise and often fantastical. What is clear is that the force was large enough and mobile enough to cover enormous distances quickly and to devastate the territories through which it passed. City after city fell or was bypassed or bought off. Metz was sacked, Reims was threatened, Orleans was besieged. And the question that faced Idias and the federate peoples, who were nominally under Roman authority, was whether they could assemble a force large enough to stop him. What Idias assembled on the Catalaunian Plains in June 451 AD was one of the most diverse military forces in Roman history. It included the remnant of the regular Roman army of the West, Visigoths under their king Theodoric, Alans under their king Sangiban, who was of uncertain loyalty, Burgundians, Franks, Saxons, and various other federate peoples. The coalition was held together primarily by Idias's personal authority and by the shared recognition that an Attila who was not stopped in Gaul would be impossible to stop anywhere. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, also called the Battle of Chalons, is one of the great battles of ancient and medieval history and also one of the most obscure in its details. The ancient sources describe a massive and chaotic engagement that lasted through the afternoon and into the night. The Hunnic forces broke the Alans in the center, but were driven back by the Visigoths on the right flank. Theodoric was killed in the fighting, and by nightfall the result was effectively a draw. Attila withdrew to a defensive position behind a barrier of wagons, and Idias chose not to press a final assault. The decision not to destroy Attila completely after the Battle of the Catalaunian Plains has been debated ever since. Idias could plausibly have annihilated the Hunnic forces if he had pursued aggressively, but he chose not to. And the most commonly offered explanation is that a destroyed Hunnic confederation would leave it without the military asset he had depended on throughout his career, and that the powerful Visigothic kingdom that had contributed so much to the victory might become a greater threat to Roman Gaul than the Huns, who could be managed at a distance. This calculation, if that is what it was, reflects the desperate realpolitik of a man governing in circumstances where every decision involved choosing between bad options. Attila retreated from Gaul, having failed to win the decisive victory he needed, and in 452 AD he turned south and invaded Italy, crossing the Alps and moving down the Po Valley. He sacked Aquileia and Padua and Verona and Brescia and other cities of the North Italian plain, and he approached Rome itself. The Western imperial court had already fled from Ravenna, which was better protected by its surrounding marshes, and Rome was effectively defenseless. What stopped Attila from taking Rome is one of the great mystery stories of late antique history. He turned away from Rome after meeting with a delegation led by Pope Leo I, and the accounts of this meeting became one of the foundation stories of papal authority. Leo persuaded Attila to withdraw, and the church tradition attributed this to divine intervention, to the appearance of Saints Peter and Paul flanking the Pope with flaming swords, which persuaded even the feared king of the Huns to yield before the spiritual authority of Rome's bishop. The more prosaic explanations include plague and famine in the Hunnic forces, who had been in the field for an extended campaign in the summer heat of the Italian plain, the arrival of Eastern Roman forces that threatened Attila's supply lines and his route home, and possibly the payment of a large sum of money, which was always the most reliable way of convincing Attila to go home. All of these factors probably contributed to a decision that Leo's spiritual authority alone cannot adequately explain. But the meeting with Leo was real, and the withdrawal was real, and the story served purposes that made it important to the developing authority of the papacy, regardless of its precise historical causes. Attila returned to his base in Hungary and began planning a third campaign, this time against the Eastern Empire, intending to reverse the decision of Marcian to stop paying tribute. He never launched this campaign because, in the spring of 453 AD, on the night of his wedding to a new wife named Ildica, described in the sources as a young woman of great beauty, the manner of his death was inglorious and strange, and entirely unlike anything his life had led anyone to expect. He was found dead in his bed in the morning, with no wound, with blood flowing from his nose, beside his weeping bride, who had been too frightened to call for help in the night. The most feared man in the known world died of a nosebleed, or more precisely, of a hemorrhage, probably a burst blood vessel in the brain, or a severe nosebleed that he choked on in his sleep. He was perhaps in his late 40s. The immediate reaction of the Hunnic court was grief of the ritualized, theatrical kind that steppe peoples performed for their great leaders. His followers rode around his tent on horseback, cutting their own faces so that the great warrior would be mourned in blood. It was a tradition, Priscus describes, in connection with the Hunnic mourning practices, and it gives some sense of the ceremonial complexity that underlay what Romans often mistook for pure savagery. He was buried in a secret location. The sources say that the slaves who dug his grave were killed afterward to preserve the secret. And to this day, no one knows where Attila is buried. He is somewhere in what is now Hungary. In the soil of the plain he ruled, unmarked, which is a strange kind of ending for the man whose name had made the Roman world tremble. The aftermath of his death was exactly what the structure of the Hunnic Confederation had always made likely. It fragmented. His sons divided the confederation among themselves, and then fought each other. The subject peoples, who had been held in place by the force of his personality and the fear of his power, took the opportunity to reassert their independence. The Gepids and the Ostrogoths rose against the Huns at the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD and won a decisive victory, and the political entity that had been the Hunnic Empire dissolved within a few years of its creator's death. This rapid dissolution is one of the most striking facts about Attila's achievement and about the limitations of the kind of power he had built. It was entirely personal. It depended on him and on the fear and the loyalty that radiated from him. It had no institutional foundations that could survive his absence. No bureaucracy, no fixed laws, no mechanisms for peaceful succession, no way of transmitting authority across generations. It was a monument to one man's will, and it disappeared when that will was gone. The contrast with Rome is instructive. Rome was also deeply dependent on individual leadership, and its history is full of the damage that bad emperors did. But it had institutions, laws, administrative structures, an ideology of the res publica that gave legitimacy independent of any particular person. These structures were battered and eroded and ultimately overwhelmed, but they persisted for centuries after any individual had departed. The Western Empire fell not in 453, but in 476, and the Eastern Empire continued for another 1,000 years. The legacy of Attila in the cultures that remembered him is one of the more interesting studies in how historical memory works. In the Roman tradition, he was the scourge of God, an instrument of divine punishment for the sins of the empire, a framing that served Christian theology while also serving the practical political purpose of explaining catastrophic defeat without attributing it to Roman failure. If God had sent Attila, then the sacking of cities was not evidence of military incompetence, but of spiritual unworthiness, and repentance, rather than better armies, was the appropriate response. In the Germanic tradition, particularly in the Norse sagas and the German Nibelungen, Attila appears as the figure of Etzel or Atli, transformed from a destroyer of Rome into a generous king who is both honored and dangerous, associated with gold and with the tragic consequences of greed. The Nibelungenlied's Etzel is a king of genuine dignity, whose court is destroyed not by his own violence, but by the violence he cannot prevent. A figure of tragic grandeur in a narrative that is fundamentally about the destructive power of treasure and loyalty and revenge. In Hungarian national tradition, which developed in the medieval period, Attila was claimed as an ancestor and a predecessor of the Hungarian state. The Huns and the Magyars, who established the Hungarian kingdom in the 9th and 10th centuries, were different peoples, but they occupied the same territory, and the medieval Hungarians claimed descent from Attila's people as a way of legitimating their presence on the Danubian plain and their right to the lands they held. This claim was politically useful, even if it was historically complicated, and it attached Attila's name to a national identity in ways that made him simultaneously terrible and glorious. The various national traditions that claimed or condemned Attila are a reminder that historical figures are always also symbolic figures, that the meaning attributed to a person's life and actions is shaped by the needs of those doing the tributing, as much as by the facts of what the person actually did. Attila was a Hunnic king who extracted tribute from Rome and raided its territories and never quite conquered it and died in his sleep. The rest is interpretation. What was he actually like? The man himself, the person behind the terror and the tribute and the nosebleed death. Priscus gives us the most direct answer, and it is worth staying with his account because it resists the easy categories. The Attila that Priscus describes was controlled, cold, pragmatic, occasionally cruel, but not gratuitously so, possessed of a dry humor that surfaced in specific moments, capable of genuinely warm relationships with people he trusted, proud without vanity, in the sense that he did not need the markers of luxury to feel his own importance, patient in a way that strategic intelligence requires, willing to wait and to use diplomacy where diplomacy was cheaper and more effective than violence. He was also a man of his world and his culture, which means he operated according to values and assumptions that were genuinely different from Roman values. The loyalty he demanded was absolute, and its breach was punished absolutely. The tribute he extracted was understood as the natural right of the powerful over the less powerful. The violence of his campaigns was not distinguished in his own moral framework from the legitimate exercise of military superiority. The idea that there was something specifically wrong about attacking cities or burning fields or killing civilians would have been incomprehensible to him. These were the normal operations of warfare as he understood it. The world that surrounded him in his last years was one in profound transition. The Roman Empire of the West was in its final decades. The great migrations had populated the former Roman territories with Germanic peoples who were in the process of becoming the nations of medieval Europe. Christianity was the dominant religion of the Mediterranean world and was in the process of establishing the institutional structures that would make the Church the primary bearer of Roman civilization. After the political structure collapsed, the steppe corridor from which the Huns had emerged would send more peoples westward, the Avars and the Bulgars, and eventually the Magyars, all following the same geographic logic, all riding the same grasslands, all pressing against the same settled peoples who had not yet developed adequate responses. Attila stood near the beginning of this process, and he shaped it in ways that echoed for centuries. The the displacement of peoples that his campaigns accelerated, the weakening of the Western Empire that his tribute demands contributed to, the demonstration that the Roman Empire could be made to pay and to bow. These were facts that subsequent steppe leaders and Germanic kings drew on when calculating their own options. The city of Aquileia, which he sacked in 452 AD, and which was effectively destroyed as a functioning urban center, never fully recovered, and the refugees who fled it are traditionally credited with founding Venice, establishing their settlements on the islands of the Venetian lagoon where steppe cavalry could not follow. The origin legend of Venice may not be historically precise, but it captures a genuine dynamic. The pressure of the Hunnic campaigns drove people to places they would not otherwise have gone, and created things that would not otherwise have existed. The intellectual responses to Attila in late antique writing are another dimension of his legacy. Salvian of Marseille, a Christian writer of the 5th century, made arguments similar to the ones the Greek merchant had made to Priscus, suggesting that the Huns and Vandals and other peoples who were devastating the Roman world were in some ways morally superior to the Romans, because they had not been corrupted by the luxury and the vice and the systematic injustice that Roman civilization had produced. This argument was a form of Christian moral provocation rather than a serious historical assessment, but it reflected genuine discomfort with the gap between Roman claims of civilizational superiority and Roman behavior. The question of what Roman civilization was worth in the years of its decline is one that Attila's career poses with particular sharpness. He extracted enormous wealth from Rome and Constantinople, wealth that represented the labor of millions of people and the accumulated cultural achievement of centuries. And he used it to maintain his court and reward his followers and maintain the political structure of the Confederation. The wealth moved from settled agricultural civilization into the mobile economy of the steppe, and much of it was dispersed and lost rather than preserved. The golden cups that graced his table at the feast Priscus attended were Roman work, looted or extracted in tribute from Roman cities, and their subsequent history, scattered or buried or melted down, is typical of the fate of portable wealth in an era of upheaval. The archaeologists who work in the Danubian and Hungarian regions have found extraordinary things in the graves and hoards of the 5th century. Gold and silver objects of Roman manufacture, mixed with steppe-style ornaments and weapons. The material culture of people living in the intersection of two worlds. The contents of these graves give us something that the literary sources cannot. A view of the actual objects that passed through the Hunnic world, the quality of the metalwork, the scale of the wealth that flowed through Attila's court, the specific forms of the weapons and the harness and the vessels that made up the material life of the Hunnic aristocracy. The most famous of these archaeological finds is probably the Petrosa treasure, a hoard of golden objects found in Romania in the 19th century, though this is dated to the Visigothic rather than specifically the Hunnic period. The distinction reflects the difficulty of assigning material culture precisely in a period when peoples were mixing and objects were moving, and the categories that later scholars impose were not operative on the ground. The horses that made the Hunnic military system possible are another dimension of the story that deserves attention. The Hunnic horse was a specific type adapted to the steppe, smaller and hardier than the horses bred in the Mediterranean world, capable of surviving on grass alone without grain supplementation, able to travel enormous distances at speeds that the heavier horses of Roman cavalry could not match. The care and management of these horses was a central preoccupation of Hunnic life, and the quality of their horsemastership was one of the genuine foundations of their military superiority. The saddle and the stirrup that gave mounted archers their stability and allowed them to shoot accurately at full gallop were among the most important military technologies of the ancient world, and the degree to which the Huns and their steppe contemporaries were responsible for spreading these technologies westward is a subject of ongoing archaeological and historical debate. The evidence for early stirrup use comes primarily from the eastern steppe, and the dates are contested. But what is clear is that the Hunnic military system represented a degree of mounted archery capability that the Romans never fully matched or adequately countered. The Roman response to the Hunnic military threat was never to develop an equivalent. It was always to buy Hunnic capability through the recruitment of Hunnic mercenaries, or to develop countermeasures through heavy infantry and fixed fortifications. The inability to develop an effective, mobile cavalry arm that could meet the Huns in their own register was one of the structural weaknesses of the late Roman military, and it meant that the Romans were always reacting to Hunnic initiative rather than setting the terms of engagement. The personal courage that the ancient sources attribute to Attila is worth noting because it is sometimes lost in the image of the distant king watching his armies from a hilltop. Priscus and other sources describe him as personally present in military operations, as someone who led from the front in the manner that steppe leadership required. The paramount chief of a nomadic confederation could not maintain his authority from a safe distance. He had to be visible, had to demonstrate the qualities that his followers valued, had to share the risks of the campaigns he ordered. The theological dimension of Attila in Christian consciousness is one of the more complex aspects of his legacy. The title, Scourge of God, that attached to his name in later tradition, positioned him within a providentialist view of history that found in catastrophe the hand of divine judgment. It was a framing that the Church used repeatedly for invasions and disasters throughout the medieval period, converting military defeats into moral lessons and removing the shame of defeat by attributing it to divine will rather than human failure. But the same tradition also preserved the story of Leo, the first stopping Attila, through prayer and the authority of the Apostolic See. And this story did the opposite work. It made the Church the institution capable of accomplishing what armies could not. It established the Pope as someone whose spiritual authority exceeded the military authority of kings. It was a founding narrative for a certain kind of papal power that would be politically important throughout the medieval period. Attila served both these theological purposes simultaneously. As the Scourge, he demonstrated the consequences of sin. As the figure who yielded to Leo, he demonstrated the superior power of spiritual authority. He was a useful tool for a church trying to establish its place in a world where the political structures that had previously guaranteed order were collapsing. The actual religious life of the Huns is not well documented. They do not appear to have had a fixed theology in the manner of Christianity or Judaism or the official Roman state religion. They seem to have practiced a form of shamanism connected to the religious traditions of the steppe, with specialists who could communicate with spiritual forces and who played roles in the ceremonial life of the confederation. The consultation of these specialists before major military operations is mentioned in some sources. The divination by the examination of animal bones or entrails that is associated with steppe. Religious practice was apparently common among the Huns, and Attila himself is described as being influenced by the readings of these specialists in making military decisions, which is not different in kind from the Roman practice of consulting auguries before major operations. The integration of religious practice with political and military decision-making was universal in the ancient world, and the Hunnic version was one variant among many. The question of what Attila himself believed, in a theological or philosophical sense, is one that the sources do not help with directly. He clearly had the pragmatic flexibility about religion that characterizes people who have lived at the intersection of multiple cultures. He did not persecute Christians among his subject peoples. He accepted Christian clergy as part of the world he moved through. His court contained people of various religious traditions, and he seems not to have made religious uniformity a demand. The contrast with later medieval rulers, for whom religious unity was a central political project, is striking. The final accounting of what Attila achieved and what he failed to achieve is not simple. He demonstrated that the Roman Empire could be made to pay and to withdraw. He extended Hunnic power further west than it had ever reached. He imposed his will on the most powerful political entities of his era for 2 decades. He created a confederation that was the dominant military force in the known world during his lifetime. He died in his bed rather than in battle, which was not nothing for a man in his profession. He failed to conquer Rome. He failed to conquer Constantinople. He failed to establish a stable political entity that would survive him. He created no lasting institutions, wrote no laws, built no cities, left no monuments that have been identified and preserved. His name is the only thing that has truly survived, and his name has survived so thoroughly that it is still used. In languages he never heard, in contexts he could not have imagined, as a shorthand for a specific kind of terrifying force. That is a strange kind of immortality, to have your name become a word, to be so extreme in what you represented that your name outlasts not only your empire, but the empires you threatened. The grass grows over the Hungarian plain where his wooden hall once stood. The Danube moves between its banks toward the sea. The steppe stretches east toward the horizon in the direction from which his people came. And somewhere in that soil, in an unmarked place that 5 centuries of searching has not found, the most feared man in the known world is sleeping a sleep from which no tribute and no army and no diplomatic pressure will ever wake him. The night is very quiet now. The horses have stopped running. The fires are out. The plain is still under a sky full of stars. Sleep well. The world is a long way from those days, and the grasslands have been quiet for a very long time. The world that the Huns moved through on their long migration from the central steppe to the Danubian plain was not empty. It was populated by peoples whose own histories stretched back centuries and whose encounter with the Hunnic expansion was one of the defining experiences of their eras. The Alans were an Iranian-speaking nomadic people who had been present on the western steppe for generations, and who were among the first peoples to feel the full force of Hunnic military pressure. Some of them were absorbed into the Hunnic Confederation. Others were pushed westward into the Roman world, and their story is one of the many threads that the Hunnic expansion pulled loose from the fabric of the late antique world. The Goths, who are the most important of the peoples displaced by Hunnic pressure in terms of their subsequent impact on Rome, were themselves divided into eastern and western groups, the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, whose separate trajectories after the Hunnic disruption shaped the history of the Western Empire in different ways. The Visigoths, who crossed the Danube in 376, and whose revolt ended at Adrianople in 378, were the direct cause of the first great shock to Roman military dominance, and the subsequent settlement of Visigoths within the empire as federates established the model that would be followed by other peoples, and that would ultimately transform the Western Empire from a Roman state to a collection of Germanic kingdoms. The relationship between the Huns and the Gothic peoples who were incorporated into their confederation is one of the more complex aspects of the Hunnic world. The Ostrogoths in particular were, for a time, thoroughly subject to Hunnic authority. Their leadership killed or subordinated, their military forces used as auxiliary troops in Hunnic campaigns, and yet their cultural identity survived the Hunnic period intact enough that they re-emerged as an independent people after Attila's death and went on to establish the Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy under Theodoric the Great, one of the most sophisticated of the successor states. The survival of Gothic cultural identity under Hunnic domination tells us something about the nature of the Hunnic system. It was extractive rather than transformative. It demanded tribute and military service and political submission, but it did not attempt to replace the cultural practices of subject peoples with Hunnic ones. The Confederation was a structure of domination rather than assimilation, and this meant that when the structure collapsed, as it did rapidly after Attila's death, the constituent peoples were intact enough to reassert their own trajectories. The economic foundations of the Hunnic Confederation are worth dwelling on because they explain a great deal about Attila's political behavior. The Confederation needed a continuous inflow of wealth to maintain the loyalty of the tribal leaders, who were its constituent parts. The paramount chief of a steppe confederation could not simply order compliance in the manner of a settled monarch with a permanent bureaucracy and a coercive apparatus. He had to maintain loyalty through the distribution of wealth, through the demonstration of continued military success, through the guarantee that membership in the Confederation was more profitable than independence. This meant that the tribute extracted from Rome and Constantinople was not merely a bonus on top of a self-sustaining political economy. It was a structural necessity. The Confederation needed the tribute to function, and the demand for ever-increasing tribute that characterized Attila's reign reflected not just greed or ambition, but the genuine political requirement to continue distributing wealth to maintain unity. When the tribute stopped flowing, as it did after Attila's death, when there was no one capable of extracting it, the Confederation's ability to reward its members collapsed, and with it, the political structure that required rewarding. The silk that came from the eastern trade routes through the steppe was another form of wealth that flowed through the Hunnic world. The Silk Road that connected China to the Mediterranean passed through or near territories the Huns controlled, and the ability to tax or raid this trade was a source of wealth and political leverage. The luxury goods that ended up in Hunnic graves and hoards reflect not only tribute from Rome, but the broader flows of commerce that passed through the steppe world. The material culture of the Hunnic aristocracy, as revealed by archaeology, is one of polychrome splendor. The gold and garnet work that is associated with the Hunnic and post-Hunnic period in the Danubian region is of extraordinary technical quality, combining steppe metalworking traditions with motifs and techniques acquired through contact with the Roman world. The animal style that had been characteristic of steppe metalwork for centuries mingled with classical decorative elements in pieces that are neither purely steppe nor purely Roman, but genuinely synthesized. The craftsmen who produced this work were not Huns in most cases. They were skilled artisans from the various peoples under Hunnic authority or from the Roman world, working to order for Hunnic patrons, producing objects that served Hunnic cultural purposes while using skills and techniques that came from outside the Hunnic tradition. It is a reminder that the material achievements of powerful military states are usually built on the skills of the peoples they dominate rather than the skills of the dominators themselves. The relationship between Attila and the Western Roman court in the years leading up to the Gallic campaign involved a complicated network of marriage negotiations, diplomatic exchanges, and political maneuvering that the ancient sources describe in detail that is sometimes difficult to follow. Attila had numerous wives and used marriage alliances as a tool of political management among the tribal leaders of the Confederation and in his dealings with neighboring peoples. The proposal to marry Honoria was consistent with this pattern, even if its specific circumstances were unusual. The figure of Itius, who opposed Attila at the Catalaunian Plains, deserves more attention than the narrative of the battle allows. He was, by any measure, one of the most remarkable figures of the late Roman West, a man who had spent his career maintaining a failing empire through a combination of diplomatic skill, military ability, and the exploitation of barbarian military forces whose loyalty he had cultivated over decades. The fact that he had been a hostage among the Huns in his youth and had maintained personal relationships in the Hunnic world throughout his career meant that, when he faced Attila at Chalons, he was facing a man he had known personally since childhood. The battle itself, while significant as the check it placed on Attila's Gallic ambitions, was not the decisive engagement that later tradition sometimes made it. Attila was not destroyed. His forces were not broken. He withdrew in good order and invaded Italy the following year with what remained of his military capacity. The significance of Chalons was more symbolic than strictly military. It demonstrated that Attila could be stopped and that the coalition of Roman and Federate forces could function effectively together under good leadership. But it did not end the Hunnic threat or fundamentally alter the balance of power. Idias was himself killed in 454 AD, stabbed by the Emperor Valentinian III in a fit of jealousy and fear that eliminated the last genuinely capable military commander in the Western Empire. The emperor who killed him reportedly said he did not know why he had done it, which is one of those lines that carries the full weight of late Roman dysfunction in a single sentence. The Western Empire lost its greatest general to imperial paranoia 1 year after Attila died of a nosebleed, and neither loss could have been anticipated or planned for. Both were the kind of random contingency that demonstrates how fragile complex systems are when they depend on individual human beings who can die at any moment in any manner. Valentinian III was himself murdered the following year by the supporters of Idias, and the Western Empire entered its final 20 years of accelerating dysfunction. The emperors came and went with increasing speed, controlled by the Germanic generalissimos who had replaced Idias as the effective military power, until in 476 AD, the last Western emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus, was deposed without ceremony by Odoacer, a Germanic chieftain who simply decided there was no longer any need for the fiction of a Roman emperor in the West, and sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople. The Eastern Empire survived and continued, managing the post-Hunnic world with the greater resources and the more defensible geography that had always made it more resilient than the West. It faced its own pressures, its own invasions, its own internal crises, but it had the institutional depth and the economic resources to absorb shocks that would have destroyed the West. It would continue for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire, maintaining Roman law and Roman culture in a Greek-speaking form, until Constantinople finally fell to the Ottomans in 1453 AD, 1,000 years after Attila had stood before its walls and been paid to go away. The transformation of the Roman world that Attila's career both reflected and accelerated is one of the most consequential events in Western history, not because Attila created it, but because his campaigns intensified pressures that were already transforming a world in ways that could not be reversed. The Germanic kingdoms that replaced the Western Empire were built partly from the cultural and institutional fragments of Rome, and they would eventually develop into the nations of medieval and modern Europe. The Christian Church that survived the fall of the Western Empire became the primary bearer of classical learning and the primary institutional framework for the societies that replaced Rome. None of this was what Attila intended or could have foreseen. He was pursuing the logic of his own political situation, extracting wealth from Rome to maintain his confederation, using military pressure to extract political concessions, managing the tribal leaders who constituted his power base through the distribution of what he took. The vast historical consequences of his campaigns were no more intended by him than the founding of Venice was intended by the residents of Aquileia who fled his sacking of their city. This is one of the truths that historical study keeps returning to. The largest consequences of historical events are rarely the ones that the people living through them intended or could foresee. The men and women who made the decisions that shaped history were mostly trying to solve immediate problems with the tools available to them. And the long chains of consequence that extended from their decisions were as invisible to them as the long chains of consequence extending from our decisions are to us. Attila, trying to maintain the loyalty of his tribal confederation. Idius, trying to maintain the fiction of Roman military power in Gaul. Leo I, trying to preserve the city of Rome from sack. The refugees from Aquileia building their first reed huts on the islands of the lagoon. None of them knew what they were actually doing in the largest historical sense. They were just living in their world and making the best decisions they could with the information and the resources they had. The names that survive from this era are the names of the powerful, the kings and generals and popes whose decisions shaped events on the largest scale. But the history was also made by the millions of ordinary people who lived through it. The farmers who abandoned their fields when the Hunnic cavalry appeared on the horizon. The city dwellers who sheltered behind their walls and prayed. The refugees who moved across Europe in the wake of the invasions, carrying whatever they could. The craftsmen who kept making beautiful objects through all the catastrophe. The monks who kept copying manuscripts in their monasteries while the world outside burned. The history of catastrophic change is also the history of human resilience, of the persistence of culture and craft, and learning through the most difficult circumstances. And the world that emerged from the 5th century, though it had lost much of what Rome had built, had also preserved much and was building new things on old foundations. The story does not end with Attila or with the fall of Rome. It continues, as stories do, in ways that no one then alive could see or plan. The steppe that sent Attila west is still there, still stretching from Hungary to Manchuria, still covered in the same grass that his horses grazed, still generating the same winds that carried his scouts' reports back to his wooden hall. Still beautiful in the particular way that open spaces are beautiful, with the sky enormous above the flat land and the distance visible all the way to the horizon where the earth curves away. The rivers he crossed, the Danube and the Rhine and the Po, are still flowing, still carrying their loads of sediment and memory toward the same seas they have always reached. The cities he sacked, Aquileia and Metz and Reims and the others, have been rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt again over 15 centuries, their stones recycled and their streets redrawn and their names preserved even when everything else changed. And the plain in Hungary where he feasted his followers and received the tribute of the known world is now farmland and small towns and the ordinary life of a modern European country, with no visible trace of the wooden hall and the carved cups and the fear that radiated outward from this point for 20 years and reached to the ends of the earth. He is gone. The Confederation is gone. The Western Empire he extorted is gone, and yet the story persists, carried forward by the human need to understand where we came from and what made us, by the particular fascination that extreme power and extreme violence exercise on the human imagination, by the questions that Attila's life poses about the relationship between force and civilization, between terror and tribute, between the individual and the historical forces that both shape them and flow through them. Those questions do not have simple answers. They are the questions that history keeps asking in different forms. And the answering of them is part of what it means to be the kind of creatures we are, curious and mortal and unable to stop looking back at the things that shaped us. The night is very deep now. The plain is silent. Somewhere in the dark, a horse moves through the grass, and the stars that Attila saw from his wagon on the steppe are the same stars that shine above you now. And the distance between then and now, which is everything, is also somehow nothing at all. Rest now. The story will be there in the morning. To understand Attila fully, you need to understand the late Roman Empire he preyed upon, because the empire was not the confident world-conquering machine it had been in the 1st and 2nd centuries. It was a structure under profound stress, managing problems that were structural and not merely situational. Problems that no individual emperor, however capable, could fully solve. The economy of the late Roman Empire was one of the central problems. The tax base that funded the armies and the administration had been eroding for decades, partly because of the loss of territory to the invaders and federates who were settling inside the empire's nominal borders, partly because of the currency debasement that several emperors had used as a short-term fix and that had produced long-term inflation and economic disruption, partly because the wealthy landowning class that generated much of the taxable surplus was increasingly effective at evading taxation through political influence and legal manipulation. The great estates, the latifundia that had been growing in size and power since the late Republic, were by the 5th century the dominant form of agricultural organization in most of the Western Empire, and the coloni, the tied tenant farmers who worked these estates, were in a condition that was not quite slavery, but was not quite freedom either, bound to the land by custom and law and debt, unable to leave, vulnerable to the demands of their landlords in ways that the formal protections of Roman law inadequately addressed. This economic structure produced enormous wealth for the senatorial aristocracy and inadequate revenue for the imperial government, and the gap between these two was one of the fundamental problems of late Roman governance. The aristocracy that was supposed to provide the leadership and the loyalty and the financial support of the empire was increasingly capable of using its wealth to insulate itself from the demands the empire made on it, while the ordinary population bore a tax burden that the sources describe as crushing. The military consequences of this fiscal weakness were severe. The regular Roman army had been supplemented and then increasingly replaced by federate forces, barbarian warriors who served under their own leaders in exchange for pay and grants of land. The foederati were often effective soldiers, but their loyalty was contractual rather than ideological. They served as long as the contracts were honored and fought for their own interests as much as for Roman ones. The transformation of the Roman army from a force of Roman citizens to a force of barbarian federates was both cause and effect of the empire's declining capacity to maintain its own security. The bureaucracy of the late Roman Empire was enormous by ancient standards and increasingly ineffective. The documents that survive from the 5th century, the constitutions and rescripts and laws collected in the Codex Theodosianus published in 438 AD, show an administration that was trying to govern through an immense volume of detailed legislation, while the actual enforcement capacity on the ground was inadequate to implement what was being decreed. The gap between the elaborate legal structure and the actual practice of governance was one of the more striking features of the late empire, and it contributed to the cynicism about Roman institutions that Priscus's Greek merchant had expressed so directly. The church in the 5th century was simultaneously a source of strength and a source of tension for the late Roman state. It was the most effective institution in the Western Empire in terms of its organizational reach into every community, its ability to raise money and command loyalty, its provision of social services through the care of the poor and the sick. It was also deeply absorbed in theological controversies that were at least as politically divisive as they were spiritually significant. The debates about the nature of Christ, about the relationship between the human and divine in the person of Jesus, had been generating violent conflict for decades and would continue to do so for centuries. Pope Leo I, the man who met Attila outside Rome in 452 AD, was one of the great architects of medieval papal authority, and his success in that meeting, whatever its actual causes, was interpreted and used as a demonstration of the Church's capacity to do what secular power could not. In the years after the collapse of the Western Empire, the Church's claim to a kind of authority that transcended the political structures of the day would become increasingly important. And the story of Leo and Attila was one of the founding narratives of that claim. The monasticism that was spreading rapidly through the Western Church in the 5th century was another response to the instability of the era. The withdrawal from the world into communities of prayer and labor and study was a form of resilience, a way of preserving the things that mattered: learning and spiritual practice and communal organization. In circumstances where the outer world was increasingly unable to protect them, the monasteries that Benedict of Nursia would begin organizing in the late 5th and early 6th centuries would eventually become the primary institutions for the preservation of classical learning. Through the dark ages that followed the Western Empire's collapse, the people of the 5th century did not know. They were living through a transformation that historians would later call the fall of Rome. They knew they were living through difficult times, through invasions and economic hardship and political instability, and the death of things that had seemed permanent. But the end point of the process was not visible to them, and the name that later ages would give to what they experienced was not available to them as a framework for understanding their situation. This is worth remembering when we think about Attila's contemporaries and how they experienced his campaigns. They were not watching history's grand narrative unfold. They were dealing with a specific threat that was very large and very frightening and very immediate. They were praying and negotiating and fighting and fleeing and hiding and dying in circumstances that felt catastrophic precisely because catastrophic is what they were. And the meaning that later ages would extract from those circumstances was not part of their experience of them. The refugees who left Aquileia and built the first settlement on the Venetian lagoon did not know they were founding Venice. They were just trying to find somewhere safe where Hunnic cavalry could not easily reach. They were solving an immediate problem with the most practical solution available. The fact that this solution turned out to be the origin of one of the greatest cities in medieval Europe was invisible to them in the moment of their flight, and would have seemed, if anyone had suggested it, impossible to believe. The texture of daily life in the territories through which Attila's campaigns passed is something that the historical sources describe primarily in terms of destruction, which tells us what was lost but not what remained, and not what ordinary life was like between the raids. The villa economy of the Danubian provinces, the farming communities and the small towns and the road stations and the river crossings that made up the fabric of provincial Roman life, was periodically devastated by Hunnic raids and by the broader disruption that the Hunnic presence on the frontier created even in the intervals between formal campaigns. The abandonment of villas in the Danubian provinces, documented archaeologically through the destruction layers and the absence of continued occupation that the excavations reveal, represents not only military destruction, but the broader economic disruption that made it impossible or unprofitable to maintain agricultural production in territories that were subject to regular raiding. The movement of population away from exposed territories toward more defensible locations toward the cities and the monasteries and the islands was a long-term process that cumulatively transformed the settlement pattern of the regions most affected. The languages of the 5th century Mediterranean world are another dimension of the era's complexity. Latin was the language of administration and law in the Western Empire, Greek in the Eastern Empire, but the ordinary speech of the population was already moving away from classical Latin in the Western provinces toward the regional vernaculars that would eventually become French and Spanish and Italian and Portuguese and Romanian. The Romanized peoples of the barbarian kingdoms would speak these evolving Spallers Romance languages while also learning varying amounts of Germanic from their new rulers. And the linguistic map of Europe was being drawn in this period in ways that have shaped it ever since. The survival of Latin as a learned language through the Church and through the educational traditions that the Church maintained was one of the more remarkable cultural achievements of the late antique and early medieval period. A language that had ceased to be a mother tongue for anyone continued to be used as the medium of theology and law and diplomacy and eventually of science and philosophy for another 1,000 years. And this survival meant that the accumulated learning of the classical world remained accessible to those with the education to read it, even as the political structures that had produced it disappeared. The manuscripts that preserve the ancient sources for Attila's life, including the works of Priscus and Ammianus Marcellinus, and the church historians who wrote about the Hunnic invasions, survived through a chain of copyings in medieval monasteries that was precarious and contingent, and that easily might not have happened. The texts we have are a fraction of what was written, preserved by the accidents of medieval copying culture, and the gaps in our knowledge of the Hunnic period are partly a reflection of what was not preserved as much as what was not recorded. Priscus's full account of his journey to Attila's court is lost. We have only fragments preserved in later compilations, and the fragments we have are invaluable precisely because they give us a direct observer's testimony about something that the other sources describe only from the outside. If we had the complete Priscus, we would know the Hunnic world in the 5th century as we know the Roman world through Tacitus or the Greek world through Thucydides, with the texture and the detail that sustained first-hand observation provides. Instead, we have fragments, and we work with them as carefully as we can. The question of Attila's name and what it meant in his own language is one that linguists have debated for a long time without reaching a consensus. Various derivations have been proposed, from a Turkic word meaning father or uncle, from a Gothic word meaning little father, from a hypothetical Hunnic root that cannot be reconstructed with certainty. The uncertainty reflects the broader problem with Hunnic linguistics. The Hunnic language is not attested in any sustained form, and can only be partially reconstructed from names and loanwords in neighboring languages, which is insufficient for confident conclusions about etymology or even about the language family to which Hunnic belonged. The personal names preserved in the sources for Hunnic leaders and nobles are a mixed collection that includes names that look Germanic and names that look Turkic and names that resist easy categorization, reflecting the mixed cultural environment of the Confederation and the difficulty of drawing clear linguistic or ethnic boundaries in a world where peoples were constantly mixing and moving. The category of the Hun in the 5th century was probably more a political than an ethnic identity, encompassing numerous peoples who had been incorporated into the Confederation and who shared political affiliation more than common descent. The aftermath of the Hunnic Confederation's collapse opened the way for the peoples who had been under Hunnic domination to reassert their own political identities, and the history of the period immediately after Attila's death is a history of the rapid reemergence of competing power centers in the space that the Huns had dominated. the Ostrogoths, the Gepids, the Rusians, the Siri, the Heralds, and various other peoples, all moved to establish their own territories and their own political arrangements in the former Hunnic space. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, would eventually establish the most sophisticated of these post-Hunnic polities, the Ostrogothic Kingdom of Italy, that ruled from 493 to 553 AD. Theodoric had himself spent years as a hostage in Constantinople and had absorbed the Roman administrative and cultural tradition in ways that shaped his governance of Italy. He maintained the Roman legal system, employed Roman administrators, patronized Roman cultural life, and attempted to rule the mixed population of Romans and Goths. When they found his Arianism theologically offensive, the world that emerged from the Hunnic disruption was genuinely post-Roman, in the sense that the political structures that had organized the Western Mediterranean for 5 centuries were gone and were not going to return. But it was also profoundly shaped by Rome, in the sense that Roman law and Roman culture and Roman Christianity were the materials from which the possessor states built their own identities. The barbarian kings, who replaced the Roman emperors, mostly wanted to be heirs to Rome rather than destroyers of it. They wanted the prestige and the legitimacy that Roman association provided, and this meant that Rome persisted in transformed form even after the political structure collapsed. Attila stands at the beginning of this transformation, not as its cause, but as one of the forces that accelerated and intensified processes that were already underway. His legacy is inseparable from the broader story of late antiquity, the long, complicated transition from the ancient world to the medieval world that took place across several centuries and that is still being interpreted and debated by historians today. What is not debated is that he was real, that he was extraordinary in the specific register of military and political power, that the fear he inspired was genuine, and the tribute he extracted was real, and the campaigns he conducted left physical marks on the landscape that archaeology can still trace. He was not a myth, not a legend, not a symbol, but a person who lived and acted and died in a specific world that we can partially reconstruct. And in the reconstruction, we find something that the legend obscures: a human being navigating the specific constraints and opportunities of his situation, making choices that had consequences he could not fully anticipate, exercising a power that was both genuinely his and genuinely contingent on the cooperation of the people around him, building something that was magnificent in its moment and fragile in its foundations, as most things built by individual human will tend to be. The Danube is silver in the moonlight, the plain is dark and still, and somewhere beneath the Hungarian soil that has absorbed 5 centuries of history since he was buried there, the most feared man in the known world is at rest, and above him the same stars are turning that turned above him when he rode, and the grass is growing, and the world is very quiet. The women of the Hunnic world are almost invisible in the historical record, which is not because they were absent or unimportant, but because the sources that preserved the Hunnic story were written by men from cultures that found women's lives less interesting or less relevant than men's, and because the oral traditions of the Hunnic Confederation, which presumably preserved a fuller picture, were not written down in any form that has survived. What we can recover is partial. The sources mention Hunnic noble women in connection with their husbands and their marriages. The excavation of grave goods has revealed that women of high status in the Hunnic and related steppe cultures were buried with jewelry and personal objects of considerable value, suggesting social positions that were not negligible. And the accounts of Attila's court that Priscus provides mention women as presences at the feasts and in the household, in ways that suggest they were part of the social life of the Confederation. even if the political decisions were made by the men. The wife of Attila's chief minister, one Agesius, who prepared a feast for the Roman embassy and presented them with gifts, appears briefly in Priscus's account as a person of obvious status, who was managing a complex household with evident competence. The women who appear as the wives of tribal leaders in the sources were clearly people of importance within the social structure of the confederation, even if their importance was defined primarily through their relationships with powerful men. The specific story of Ildiko, the young woman on whose wedding night Attila died, is one that the ancient sources handle with varying degrees of speculation. Some later accounts suggested that she had deliberately killed him, perhaps as an act of revenge for Hunnic violence against her people. But the contemporary sources provide no evidence for this, and the most parsimonious explanation for Attila's death, a severe hemorrhage during the night, requires no such dramatic intervention. The murder theory is the kind of story that attaches itself to the deaths of powerful men because sudden, natural death seems somehow inadequate to the scale of the person. Ildiko herself disappears from the historical record. After Attila's death, her subsequent life and fate are unknown, which is typical of the way women in the ancient sources appear briefly and then are gone, their stories only recorded when they intersected with the stories of men that the sources found worth preserving. The children of Attila were numerous. The sources mention several sons by different wives, Elok and Dengizik and Ernok being the three most prominent, and the division of the confederation among them after his death was the mechanism that destroyed what he had built. Each son had his own following among the tribal leaders. Each had his own territorial claims, and the conflict among them provided the opportunity for the subject peoples to reassert their independence that the Battle of Nidau in 454 AD represented. Elok was killed at Nidau, the eldest son of the man who had made Rome tremble, dying in a rebellion of peoples his father had dominated. Dengizik continued to press against the eastern Roman border for years after his father's death, eventually being defeated and killed in 469 AD. His head sent to Constantinople and displayed in the Hippodrome, a final reversal of the relationship that had seen Constantinople paying his father to stay away. Ernek, the youngest, retreated eastward to the lower Danube region, and his descendants are sometimes connected to later steppe peoples in ways that cannot be definitively established. The speed of the Hunnic Confederation's dissolution after Attila's death is one of the clearest demonstrations of what kind of entity it had been. It was a personal empire, held together by one person's authority and by the rewards that person could distribute. When the person was gone and the rewards stopped flowing, the structure had no alternative foundation. The tribal leaders, who had subordinated themselves to Attila, had done so because it was profitable and because resistance was futile. Neither of these conditions survived his death. This pattern of the personal empire that rises rapidly and falls rapidly with its creator is one that repeats throughout the history of the steppe. Genghis Khan built a larger empire 3 centuries later by similar methods, and his confederation fragmented similarly after his death into competing successor states. The Mongol Empire that Genghis created was in some ways more institutionally developed than the Hunnic Confederation, but it was still fundamentally dependent on the personal authority of the ruler and on the loyalty bought through military success and the distribution of plunder. When the unified direction was gone, the structure divided. The comparison between Attila and Genghis Khan is one that historians have made since the first serious scholarship on both figures. They share the geographical origin on the Eurasian steppe, the military method of mounted archery, the political structure of the tribal confederation under a paramount chief, the pattern of extracting tribute from settled civilizations, the personal empire that fragmented after the founder's death. The reputation for devastating violence that the settled peoples they attacked preserved in their historical memory. The differences are also significant. Genghis Khan built a more durable institutional framework, had more success in establishing successors who could maintain something of what he built, and conquered and administered far larger territories than Attila ever controlled. Attila never took Constantinople and never took Rome. His campaigns inflicted enormous damage and extracted enormous tribute, but they did not result in the kind of stable, Mongol-style domination that replaced existing governments with a new ruling class. This may reflect the different historical circumstances as much as any difference in the men themselves. Attila was operating against a Roman Empire that was weak, but that still had the institutional depth and the military capacity to resist ultimate conquest. Genghis Khan was operating against states that were, in some cases, more thoroughly weakened by internal conflicts, and the demographic and military weight behind the Mongol expansion was probably greater than what the Huns could mobilize. The specific geography of Attila's world, the Carpathian Basin that served as his base, was both an advantage and a constraint. It was excellent grazing land that could support large horse herds and therefore large cavalry forces. It was accessible to the Danubian provinces of Rome through the river crossings that Attila used repeatedly. It was far enough from Constantinople that a major campaign against the eastern capital required extended supply lines, and it was surrounded by mountains that provided defensible borders but also limited the directions from which the Confederation could expand. The Hungarian Plain, which Attila made his base and which the Huns had already been using for decades before his rise, would continue to attract steppe peoples for centuries after his death. The Avars occupied it from the late 6th century, the Magyars from the late 9th century, and both peoples followed the same geographic logic: a Central European grassland accessible to the settled peoples of both East and West, ideal for the mobile military style of steppe peoples, and far enough from the great powers of the Mediterranean to allow a degree of independence. The Avar Khaganate that occupied the Hungarian plain from roughly 567 to 803 AD had organizational and military similarities to the Hunnic Confederation and caused similar anxiety among its neighbors. It extracted tribute from Constantinople as the Huns had raided deep into the Balkans and into Western Europe, and was eventually broken by Charlemagne's campaigns in the 790s. The pattern was familiar enough that contemporaries made explicit comparisons between the Avars and the Huns. The Magyar kingdom that emerged in the 10th century under Stephen I and that became the Kingdom of Hungary was a transformation of steppe political organization into something more permanently settled, more institutionally developed, more integrated with the Christian civilization of Western Europe. The Magyars made the transition from raiding to ruling that the Huns had never quite completed, and in doing so, they created a state that has persisted in various forms to the present. The long shadow of the Hunnic period over Hungarian national identity is something that medieval Hungarian chroniclers were fully aware of, and that they used in specific ways. The claim of descent from Attila's people, the association of the Hungarian kingdom with the tradition of steppe power that Attila represented, was a source of prestige and legitimacy, even when the historical connection was more symbolic than genetic. It placed the Hungarian kingdom in a lineage of powerful rulers of the Danubian plain, and it claimed for it a history that went back further than the Magyar settlement of the late 9th century. The ruins of the Roman frontier along the Danube are still visible in the landscape of modern Hungary, Austria, and the former Yugoslav republics. The limes, the complex of fortifications, watchtowers, and military camps that the Romans built to control the Danubian frontier has been partially excavated and partially preserved, and it gives some physical sense of the enormous investment Rome made in defending this line against the peoples north of it. The scale of the fortification system, which included major legionary fortresses at Carnuntum and Aquincum, and dozens of smaller installations along hundreds of miles of frontier, reflects the seriousness of the threat that the northern peoples represented and the determination of Rome to contain it. The watchtowers that dotted the Roman bank of the Danube at regular intervals were the early warning system, manned by soldiers who could signal up and down the line when a threat was detected. The signal fires and the flags that transmitted information faster than any horse could carry it were a form of military communication that was sophisticated for its era, and that allowed the Roman commanders to concentrate forces at threatened points with a speed that would otherwise have been impossible. Attila's forces crossing the Danube in force would have been signaled along the entire frontier within hours of the crossing beginning. The iron discipline that the Roman military system represented at its best is part of the context for understanding why Attila's military successes against Rome were so significant. He was not defeating an undisciplined rabble. He was defeating, or forcing to pay tribute, the most professionally organized military force in the Western world. And the fact that he could do this repeatedly and on such a scale was a measure of both his military effectiveness and the degree to which the Roman military system had declined from its peak. The logistics that supported Attila's campaigns were considerable and not often discussed. The movement of large cavalry forces across Central Europe required the management of forage and water for thousands of horses, the management of supplies for the human element of the force, the maintenance of the wagon trains that carried the campaign's material support, the coordination of forces drawn from multiple tribal groups with different leaders and different cultural practices. All of this required organizational capacity that the image of the wild nomad horde tends to obscure. Attila was not just a warrior, but an organizer, a man capable of managing the logistics of large-scale military operations across considerable distances. The campaigns of 451 and 452 AD that ranged from the Rhine to Italy required sustained organizational effort that was invisible to the people on the receiving end, but that was real, and that was one of the foundations of his military effectiveness. The peace negotiations that followed each of his major campaigns were another form of organizational achievement. The diplomatic exchanges with Rome and Constantinople involved translators and envoys, and the management of complex political relationships that required patience and sophistication. Attila understood the Roman diplomatic system from the inside, having been a hostage in it, and he used that understanding to maximum advantage, knowing when to press and when to accept, when to make demands that were realistic, and when to make demands that were opening positions in a negotiation. The tribute payments that resulted from these negotiations were delivered in gold, the solid gold coin that was the standard monetary unit of the late Roman economy, and the quantities involved were substantial. The Treaty of Margus in 435 AD set the annual payment at 700 pounds of gold. The subsequent treaty after the 447 campaign increased this to 2,100 pounds per year, with an additional lump sum payment of 6,000 pounds to cover arrears. These were not trivial sums. They represented a meaningful fraction of the Eastern Empire's annual tax revenue, and their payment was a genuine burden on the imperial finances. The gold that flowed from Constantinople and Ravenna into Attila's confederation was part of the larger circulation of wealth that characterized the late antique world. It did not disappear. It was melted down or used as currency, or buried in hoards, or made into the polychrome jewelry that fills the museums of Central Europe. It moved through the Hunnic world and out, again through trade and tribute and gift exchange in ways that we can partially trace through the archaeological record. The gold solidi that Roman men struck in enormous quantities, standardized coins of consistent weight and purity that served as the hard currency of the late antique economy, appear in archaeological contexts throughout the former Hunnic sphere and beyond, carried by trade and tribute and the movements of people. They are one of the threads that connect the Hunnic world to the broader economic networks of the 5th century. The silence of the Hungarian plain on a winter night, with the stars enormous above the flat land and the cold settling into the grass, is not very different from what it was in Attila's time. The seasons come and go the same way they always have. The rivers freeze and thaw. The grass greens and browns. The birds arrive in spring and leave in autumn. And the land is indifferent to all the human ambition and human suffering that has passed across it. This is perhaps the most honest thing to say about Attila in the end, that the land he ruled is still there and he is not, that the forces of history he rode are still moving in the world in forms he could not have recognized, that the fear he inspired is gone, but the fascination persists, that he was a man who lived fully in his time and in his place, and who shaped his world in ways both large and small, and that the meaning of his life, like the meaning of all lives, is something that depends on who is doing the asking and what they need the answer to be. We have been traveling with him for a long time now, across the steppe and across the centuries, and the journey comes to rest here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the long patience of the grass. Sleep now, the plain is still, and the stars are very bright. The diet of the Huns is one of the details that ancient sources mention with the particular fascination that people have always felt for the food practices of others. Ammianus Marcellinus describes them eating raw meat, semi-cooked between their thighs and the backs of their horses, which is the kind of detail that establishes the eater as savage, and therefore available for everything the savage category implies. The reality was probably both more ordinary and more interesting than this. Nomadic steppe peoples had a diet built around the products of their herds, meat and milk and the fermented mare's milk called kumis. That was the characteristic drink of the steppe, supplemented by whatever grain and vegetables and other foods could be obtained through trade or raid from agricultural peoples. The kumis, that was the standard drink of the steppe peoples, was genuinely different from wine. It was mildly alcoholic, slightly sour, not too Mediterranean tastes, and its presence at Hunnic feasts, alongside the Roman wine that was served to guests, like priscus, reflects the cultural mixing of the Confederation. Attila's court drinking, both the traditional steppe beverage and the imported luxury of Roman viticulture, each serving different social purposes. The kumis connecting the court to its steppe identity, and the wine connecting it to the Roman world it both fought and imitated. The felt tents that were the traditional Hunnic dwelling were not the primitive shelters that Roman sources implied. The construction of a proper yurt is a sophisticated engineering achievement. The curved wooden frame that supports the felt covering is made of precisely shaped components that fit together in a specific way. The felt itself is produced through a labor-intensive process of matting wool that produces a material with excellent insulating properties. The resulting structure is warm in winter and cool in summer, quick to assemble and disassemble, and capable of lasting for decades with proper maintenance. The decorated felt hangings and rugs that were part of the furnishing of Hunnic dwelling spaces are described in the sources and supported by examples from archaeological contexts in the steppe region. The textile arts of the nomadic peoples were highly developed and the objects produced in felt and leather and woven wool were both functional and aesthetically sophisticated. They reflected a visual culture that operated in different registers from the painting and sculpture of the Mediterranean world, but was no less accomplished within its own terms. The horses themselves, which were the foundation of everything the Huns were and did, deserve more attention than any brief account can give them. The Przewalski horse, which is the closest living relative of the wild horse of the steppe, and which nearly went extinct in the 20th century, before being brought back through conservation efforts, gives some sense of the physical type: small and sturdy and extraordinarily tough, capable of surviving on minimal forage, resistant to the cold, with stamina that the larger horses bred in the Mediterranean world could not match. The management of horse herds of the size that Hunnic military operations required was a constant preoccupation of the Confederation's economy. The horses needed to be fed and watered and kept healthy and trained. The breeding management that maintained the quality of the herd required expertise and attention, and the veterinary knowledge that kept horses in the field condition needed for military operations was a specialized skill that the Huns had developed over generations of dependence on their animals. The bow that was the Hunnic warrior's primary weapon was a composite recurve bow, made from multiple materials laminated together: wood and horn and sinew, each contributing different properties to the finished weapon. The horn on the belly of the bow resisted compression as the bow was drawn, the sinew on the back resisted tension, and the wood provided the structure that combined these properties into a weapon of extraordinary power and precision. The recurve shape that gave the bow its characteristic profile increased the effective draw length and therefore the energy stored in a bow that was short enough to be used from horseback. The arrows themselves were carefully made, with shafts of consistent weight and straightness, fletched with feathers positioned precisely to provide stable flight, tipped with iron or bone points of specific shapes for different purposes: armor-piercing points for use against armored cavalry, barbed points for use against unarmored targets. The whole system of bow and arrow representing generations of refinement toward the specific purpose of mounted archery. The training required to use this weapon effectively from horseback at full gallop, reloading quickly enough to maintain a high rate of fire, aiming accurately enough to hit a man-sized target at 40 or 50 meters. Doing all of this while managing a horse with knees and weight shifts rather than hands was not something that could be learned in months. It was a skill that required years of practice, beginning in childhood, and that was maintained through daily use throughout adult life. The Hunnic warrior was not better armed than his Roman opponents, so much as more completely trained in the specific military skill that defined his culture's approach to war. The Roman response to the Hunnic military system evolved over time. The initial shock of encountering Hunnic cavalry for the first time, the experience of watching formations that had been trained to maintain their ground under arrow attack simply dissolve under the sustained pressure of mounted archers who refused to close to hand-to-hand range, produced both tactical and strategic adjustments: the development of heavier armored cavalry. Cataphracts was partly a response to the need for forces that could resist arrow fire better than unarmored infantry. The increasing use of the crossbow, which could be operated with less training than the composite bow, was another response. The improvement of fortifications and the petty strategy of refusing pitched battle and sheltering behind walls was the most reliable response of all. But none of these responses fundamentally solved the problem. The Hunnic cavalry could be avoided and contained, but not effectively countered in the open field by the forces available to the late Roman military. And the strategy of avoiding battle meant accepting that Hunnic raids could devastate the countryside even when the cities held. The economics of this arrangement were unfavorable to Rome, because the agricultural production that the raids destroyed was the tax base that funded the army that was failing to stop the raids. The way that Attila's campaigns were experienced at the individual level by the people in their path is something the historical sources give us only glimpses of. The letters of Sidonius Apollinaris, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat who lived through the period and wrote extensively about his world, give some sense of the anxiety and the disruption that the threat of Hunnic attack created in the Gallo-Roman aristocracy. Even before Attila's campaigns reached Gaul directly, the fear of what might come was shaping the political and social calculations of the region's leadership. The sermons and writings of bishops like Germanus of Ozzy, who is traditionally credited with organizing the defense of his city against Attila, reflect the way that Christian spiritual authority was being mobilized as a practical resource in the absence of adequate secular military protection. When the bishop could organize a defense that the imperial government could not provide, the bishop's authority expanded accordingly, and the spiritual resources of Christianity, prayer and relics, and the intercession of saints became part of the practical toolkit for managing the Hunnic threat. The specific geography of Attila's route through Gaul in 451 AD is a subject that local historians throughout the regions he passed through have debated and documented and commemorated for 15 centuries. Every town in northeastern France and the Rhine Valley has its tradition about what happened when Attila came, which settlements were spared and why, which were burned, what acts of courage or sanctity or practical wisdom saved this place or condemned that one. These local traditions are not always historically reliable, but they reflect the depth and the persistence of the memory of those events in the communities that experienced them. The saints, who are credited with saving their cities from Attila, are a roster of local patrons spread across the regions his campaigns touched. Genevieve of Paris, who is credited with organizing the prayer vigils that allegedly turned Attila away from the city. Laup of Troyes, who met Attila's forces at the gates of his city and allegedly persuaded him to spare it. Anon of Orleans, who inspired the city's defense until Idias's army arrived. All of these figures are part of the local religious traditions of their cities, and all of their stories connect the Hunnic invasion to the establishment of specifically Christian forms of protection and intercession that were presented as more reliable than the failing secular power of Rome. The memory of Attila in the places he touched is therefore not only a memory of destruction, but also a memory of the forms of resistance and survival that communities developed in the face of overwhelming external threat. And these forms of resistance, built around the bishop and the local saint and the prayers of the community and the walls of the city, were the prototypes of the specifically medieval forms of community organization that would characterize Western Europe for the next several centuries. In this sense, Attila was a maker of the medieval world, not by intention but by the pressure he applied. The responses to that pressure shaped the institutions and the values and the sense of identity of the communities that survived him. And those responses were part of the building material of what came after. The grass is growing over the plain where his horses grazed. The stars are the same stars that his scouts navigated by. The rivers run to the same seas they have always run to. And the world that he shook is still shaking in its consequences. 5.5 centuries after he died in his bed with the blood running from his nose, and his young wife weeping beside him, too frightened to call for help in the night. That is how the most feared man in the world ended, in the dark, in silence. With no armies nearby, and no tribute coming, and no enemies left to frighten, just a man in a bed and a woman who did not know what to do, and the grass growing, and the stars turning, and the long quiet of the plain.